This is Doug McIntyre, one of the editors at ClimateCrisis247, and I'm with David Calloway, who's the other editor. We're going to talk about climate change's effect on infrastructure right now, particularly the nation's highways. So, Dave, what are some of the things that are happening to the highway system? As you know, in many cases, it's decades old, like the Eisenhower turnpike highway system is probably 70 years old. It's the biggest, carries the most traffic of anything in the country. So what's going on there?
Well, it's in transition, Doug, and and like all transitions, it's leading us to things that we didn't expect when we started it, right? There is a transition to electric vehicles, which is going on. Some would say too slowly, others would say, pretty rapidly, but it's, something like 8 or 10% of all cars on the roads these days in the U.S. are electric in some capacity, more in states like California than in others. But what we're starting to realize, and the highways are always in disrepair, and the Biden administration put together an infrastructure bill a few years ago, the latest bill to kind of help repair some of the highways. But what we're starting to realize is that a lot of these electric vehicles, are made differently, right? Not only are they climate efficient because they have battery powers instead of fuel powered, but the batteries are heavier, and that's having this crazy impact on the autos and the roads. And so there was this great story we had on Climate Crisis 247 last week about the guardrails on a lot of these highways, kind of on steep areas or areas with cliffs, being unable to support against the weight of an EV coming through. I mean, it's a classic, who would have expected story. We expect that we're going to need charging stations along the nation's highways, right? And everyone's preparing for that. But this is completely unprepared. And then if you start to extrapolate what that means for the extra weight of these vehicles, replacing these guardrails with what? Stronger guardrails is going to cost a fortune and take forever. And then you have to start to look at things like bridges. Right?
Oh, sure.
Our bridge is
payload.
Yeah, our bridge is going to be able to take the extra traffic that several hundred EVs going over them might cause in the near future. So it's one of those things where we've opened Pandora's box, and we want theoretically to move towards a nation that is driving electric vehicles and electric transportation, but it's going to come with all sorts of different, expenses that we didn't foresee.
Probably a good example of two technologies coming together are these auto-driven cars and EVs. So the auto-driven cars crash a lot. And so you could crash them into a guardrail and with a heavy car, and then you've got two problems. One of the things that people don't know about EVs, and this is not an infrastructure issue, but if you think about how a car works, it is. EV tires last about half as long as tires on gas-driven cars because of the instant torque that you get. It's interesting from a scientific standpoint that wears down roads very, very fast compared to if you had gasoline-powered cars.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so that's another implication that, we didn't really see is the tires expense. We're going to need all sorts of new types of tires. I got to tell you, Doug, over the weekend, I was outside in my driveway talking to a neighbor when one of his friends drove up in one of those new Tesla Cybertrucks. You've seen the picture. It looks like something Star Wars, right? And this thing was the biggest thing I've ever seen. It looked like a tank coming down our little cul-de-sac road. And once it came, up close, it was amazing to behold, all the bells and whistles and gadgets and stuff that was on it. But it is a tank, and if there's going to be lots of people driving around in those, there's going to be massive implications. Not just on tires and bridges and guardrails and stuff, but on everything else. Particularly in traffic jams. I wouldn't want to come up against one of those in a Mini or something like that.
Another infrastructure implication, which isn't roads, but it's the grid, is you get, double the number of EVs on the roads you've got right now. Everybody bemoans the fact there aren't enough charging stations, but as that number goes up by tens of thousands, is there a way to get electricity to all those things without putting a huge burden on the infrastructure?
Well, under current infrastructure, some grids might not be able to handle it, but that's why investing in grids is one of the better opportunities for investors these days in climate change. There's a lot about, EVs and EV companies and charging stations and, all sorts of implications for solar, wind, and renewable energy. But it really all comes down to how effective we can make these grids, how sturdy we can make them, how interconnected we can make them. We've had a couple of tough years in the market in terms of renewable energy investing. But one of the areas that stuck out as profitable was investing in grid infrastructure and grid updates. So I think there is something to that, and it's another opportunity.
Is the rebuilding or refurbishment of roads for these kinds of vehicles, bridges, roads, electric infrastructure, is that a public-private partnership? Is it taxes driving most of this being public money? How does that play out over the next decade?
Yeah, it's going to have to be public led, I think. There's just not enough private money that's going to be directed towards it, even though it should. It's going to have to be public led with taxes and infrastructure spending. And you know how it works now. The government provides spending to the states and locals, in exchange for various things like having a 21-year-old drinking age and things like that. And it's going to have to be more creative than that going forward, because we're going to need, if we're going to revamp the very way we transport ourselves, we're going to need to revamp the highways as well.
One of the questions people always ask about transfer of technology going forward a generation is the current generation of technology, should it pay for a better technology? An example of this would be, should the car companies be taxed in any way so that you can have an EV future, since the cars you currently have right now aren't very good for the environment? Is there a move like that where you could go to the car companies and say, look, we can't afford to pay for this ourselves, so you've made billions and billions of dollars on cars that have polluted the world for decades, you're going to have to fund part of this?
I've no doubt that someone will try. I'm not sure it'll work, and if it does, they will just pass that on to the consumer, right? So,
right. The buck always stops with you and me.
Exactly. So, it's going to be interesting to see how this works. But I think the government is going to institute ways and rules to play by. But it's the private sector is going to find the opportunities to make money doing this. And people aren't buying Teslas because they're energy efficient. They're buying them because they look cool and they go fast. Yeah. And so this is private. Private making money off it.
There's an organization of engineers that puts out a report every 2 years that grades the highways, airports, bridges, and then they are so good that they actually list the bridges, and they list the highways, they list the airports, and they grade them. It seems one of the problems is like the F level bridges. which, they say, well, maybe those will last another 5 years. If that report were to come out today and factor in EVs, I think one of the problems would be is a lot of highways and bridges would be considered dangerous, effective immediately, as opposed to in 5 years.
I think you're probably right. I have not seen such a report factor in EVs. That's a very good point. It's something to look for.
Well, I appreciate your wisdom on this as always. I'll see you soon, and thank you.
All right. Take it easy, pal.